first began studying the future in 1980, and in fact I'm now living in the future I first described over 30 years ago.
The future has always been fascinating. Trying to predict what's going to happen has been a mystical experience. We primitive humans have consulted priests and psychologists, palmists, astrologers, in an attempt to find out what's going to happen, to take the fear out of the unknown. But now, at the end of the 20th century, we've got a far better way of looking into the future. I'll be looking at genetics, at artificial intelligence, and at the hundreds of sciences which are benefiting from these two important breakthroughs.
My interest in the future began in the late 1970s. I was living and working in San Francisco. I was creating advertising campaigns for the early personal computer companies, and I became so excited about the potential of technology for changing the human condition that when I sold my business, I went off and studied computer science. I became very influenced by the likes of Alvin Toffler, the futurist who wrote Future Shock. I loved the work of Aldous Huxley, Arthur C. Clarke, some of the later works of H.G. Wells. In fact, they set me on the path of studying the future professionally. The first book that came out of all of my study was about music, about the future of music technology, and how computers would change the way we listen to music, the way music was sold. And in fact, in that book, I predicted the end of online retail sales of music. That book did very well. In fact, it prompted a number of BBC TV crews to come and visit me in my home to talk about what computer music meant.
Well, what we've just heard was not actually a string quartet or even a duet. It was a computer, and inside this computer is stored the sounds of a violin and cello.
It's a new electronic musical world where machines can even match the skills of a composer.
Behind me, in fact, is a typical home computer.
Back in 1983, breakfast television had only just launched in the UK. I went along to TVAM, where I met up with Phil Oakey of the Human League to show the disbelieving presenters what computer-based musical instruments could do.
To give an example, although this looks like a keyboard, now we really do have a drum set. It's possible, if one wanted to play a tune on drum.
Later that same year, I began researching a new book called Computers and Your Child. My daughter Jane was just 7 at the time, and I was fascinated to learn the role that computers might play in education. I went off to MIT and I met Professor Seymour Papert, who introduced me to the programming language for children Logo and the Logo Turtle, a little robot which actually helps children learn. Computers and Your Child was a bestseller. It was published in dozens of countries in quite a number of languages, and it actually went through multiple editions. I roped in my daughter Jane and took her along to television studios when the book came out to actually show how the programming language worked and how she could operate the turtle.
He's brought along his daughter Jane. Good morning, Jane.
Good morning.
How old are you?
6.5.
6.5. Now, you not only can work this contraption, but I gather you've actually written computer programs yourself. Now, can you demonstrate one for us?
Why don't you press return on the one that we've got in the computer now.
Can you show us this? What's this program called?
It's called House.
A house. And what does it do?
Makes sounds.
Oh, really? Let's have a look.
It was in 1983 that the internet arrived properly. It was the year that TCP/IP was introduced. That's the robust protocol that underlies the internet to this day. I'd been online for some years. I was an enthusiastic user of The Well in San Francisco. That's a very early social media site. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that the internet might be an enormous thing, a giant phenomena. I became so excited about the possibilities of the new internet that I persuaded my agent and my publisher to commission me to write the online handbook. In the book, I identified search as being the key to all internet usage. And on the back cover, I explained what you could do on the internet back in 1983. You could do your shopping, your banking, you could even book plane flights. But the online handbook was something of a flop when it came out. It was way too early. Very few people outside of San Francisco were using the internet. In fact, were online at all. Perhaps only a few in France who use Minitel. But in the decades since, the online handbook has gained a new lease of life. It turns out that it was the world's first book to describe the commercial potential of the internet, and in fact the first book to describe the importance of search as the key underlying mechanism by which we all use online technology. By the late 1980s, my speaking career was keeping me very busy. I was travelling all over the world, speaking to large audiences and thoroughly enjoying it.
So when the future arrives, we try to describe it by old ideas, by old terms. When the automobile was invented, we called it the horseless carriage, because we didn't have a term. When the airplane was invented, we called it the flying machine, because we didn't have a term. We don't have the language and the grammar of this new realm.
Suddenly, 10 years after I'd written the online handbook, suddenly the internet sprang into life. I wrote Digital Business, Surviving and Thriving in an Online World. The success of Digital Business sparked real interest. I was speaking all over the world and I was doing a whole range of television appearances to discuss the internet and the potential for online commerce.
Well, I suppose I'm described as a futurologist because I've written about the future for 15 or 16 years, and before that was trying to understand the nature of digital technology and mathematics that underlie it. And my book's broadened to cover the application of technology in society, in education, for example, in healthcare, and then began to get into genetic engineering and the implications. And I suppose if you gather all these things together with the central theme of digital technology, it's in fact consideration of the future as a whole, rather than being a technologist.
By the late 90s, I felt I wanted to explore the future in a new form. I was travelling a great deal, and I found myself trapped on aeroplanes for very long periods of time. I used that time to start writing fiction. Although it was published in 2001, Emergence was set in the year 2035. It's about the arrival of super machine intelligence. Extinction was set in 2065, and it explores the effects of catastrophic climate change. Published in 2004, the clue is in the title. And my story in the cloud takes place in 2055, the time of the technological singularity. It was published in 2006. In 2007, I was brought firmly back to Earth when Plastics Europe, an industry association, asked me to write a report called The World in 2030. I found the research so interesting that in fact that report grew into a book, which I launched in Brussels in 2008 and which was presented to the European Commission.
There are 6 key drivers of the future. There are 6 things which will dominate our lives for the next 25 years. The first is global population explosion. We are today about 6.7 billion people on the planet. By the year 2030, we're going to be over 8 billion. And by the year 2050, the UN says we're going to be between 9 and 12 billion people. How are we going to find water for double the number of people on this planet? How are we going to feed them? How are we going to find the energy necessary when we have to drastically reduce our carbon emissions?
And then in 2010, I was honoured by being given a medal by the United Nations. President Mikhail Gorbachev presented me with the medal, and it was for services to futurology, to studying the future, something that I was delighted to receive. Today, I'm living in the future I first described over 3 decades ago, and thankfully it does seem fairly familiar. I'm now looking at the big trends that are going to shape the next 30 years. I'm looking at artificial intelligence, I'm looking at virtual reality, and of course I'm considering the impact of these elements on employment. I think virtual reality in particular is going to have a huge role in the near future. In fact, I think many people will prefer to spend time in VR than in what we call the real world, and that may have some serious psychological issues for individual humans. By 2050, the technological singularity will probably arrive. That's the point where computers become as capable of problem solving as human beings. If you like, they become as capable as we are. The question is, will we control them, or will they control us, or will it be somewhere in between? Perhaps we'll find out that the question itself was wrong. Anyway, I love thinking, writing, speaking about the future. I still enjoy travelling a great deal, and if we meet on the road, do come up and say hello.
I can still taste you on my lips, your tenderness.